Nothing in this podcast or on our website should be construed as medical advice. Consult your healthcare provider for your individual nutritional and medical needs. The information presented is based on our research and is strictly that of the author and not necessarily those of any professional group or other individual.
Hi, I'm Sue Becker from Bread Beckers. Welcome to Sue's Healthy Minutes. I'm so excited you've joined me today, and I hope this episode encourages you and allows you to find the answers you have been praying for the health of you and your family. Today, on Sue's Healthy Minutes, as promised, I want to share with you all the information that I have discovered in my research, both over the years as well as these past few weeks, about the so-called modern hybridized wheat. I want to do some much needed myth busting about wheat, about gluten, and the derogatory implications of the term modern wheat. As I stated last week, I know that I have addressed my concerns to some extent in both written articles and on this podcast about the abundance of misinformation pertaining to grains and, in particular, wheat. I replayed episode 7, The Truth About Wheat, for you last week to lay some groundwork about the many misconceptions surrounding wheat and, of course, gluten. Today, I am ready to go a little deeper and tackle the misinformation about modern wheat versus ancient grains and share some truth pertaining to the breeding of wheat. As I stated last week, I recently received 2 emails about concerns pertaining to the modern hybridized wheat. But this is a question I hear often. In one, the question was simply, are you concerned about the hybridization of wheat and what are the health risks? Another stated that she was told to stay away from modern wheat because it was causing the new epidemic of gluten sensitivities. I delayed addressing the subject last week, and I have once again spent the past few days reading dozens of research studies on wheat and watching multiple videos on both wheat breeding and wheat harvesting. Again, my quest was to not only discover the truth, to either refute or back up these claims, but also to know where such negative ideas about our modern wheat are coming from. And again, my head is spinning with information. There is no way in this one episode that I will cover this topic completely, as there is so much to discover and relay. But I am determined, and today I will attempt to address at least some of the common concerns and statements that I often hear made about the modern wheat of today. First and foremost, I will repeat what I have stated numerous times before. Despite what you may have heard or read, there is no genetically modified wheat grown for commercial use in the United States. This deception was largely promoted in popular books, demonizing wheat and even whole grains in general, and unfortunately, this information is now repeated everywhere on the internet, even by those who are well-meaning and especially health conscious. To further this misconception, some food companies have begun to label their products by stating as an ingredient non-GMO wheat, which to the concerned consumer makes us think, well, there must be GMO wheat out there. This is simply not true. There seems to be confusion between the terms genetic modification, or GMO, and hybridization. Hybridization is completely different from genetic modification. In plant genetics, hybridization can be defined as the process of crossing different varieties of a species that are genetically distant from each other. This can occur either naturally or deliberately as in plant breeding today. It is important to understand that hybridization does not change the genetic composition of a plant, but instead actually increases genetic diversity. This new combination creates a variability in the new plant that is often stronger than the parent plants. Much like my children, for example. My husband, Brad, and I are certainly of the same species. We are humans, but are genetically different from each other. Our children now carry a genetic composition from both of us, which is now much more diverse than either Brad or I have alone. A hybrid plant, then, is the offspring of parents that differ in genetically determined traits. There are many important common plants besides bread wheat that have been originated through either natural or deliberate hybridization, such as bananas, coffee, and peanuts, to name just a few. The process of hybridization has happened naturally since the beginning of time. This natural phenomenon actually enhances the viability of the new variety through what is known as survival of the fittest. Despite its negative evolutionary connotations, which I, of course, do not embrace, survival of the fittest is real. If climate and environmental changes occur, such as drought or insect infestation, those plants with the genetic makeup to withstand such conditions will be the ones that survive, thus passing on these strong genetic traits to their offspring. Wheat is no exception. It is important to realize that wheat is in the grass family. Yes, grass. Since the beginning of time, these varieties have crossbred naturally, yielding more desirable traits that would then become more popular varieties to domesticate. For instance, spelt, an ancient variety of wheat, is what is known as a covered grain. A covered grain is one in which the seed does not break free easily from the chaff covering. In ancient days, the harvested spelt grains had to be pounded to loosen the chaff before it could be winnowed, making it more tedious to prepare for consumption, to clean it. As varieties of wheat with thinner chaff that could easily be separated from the kernel by simply shaking and winnowing emerged naturally, these easier to clean varieties, known as naked grains, of course, became more popular. And the ancient varieties such as spelt and einkorn fell out of favor. These ancient grains are gaining some popularity today as machinery can now make the removing of this chaff easier. We actually have these varieties of ancient grains such as einkorn, emmer, and spelt because of natural hybridization or crossing. Einkorn is touted as the oldest and most ancient grain. Wheat breeders do, in fact, believe that einkorn was one of the first varieties of wheat to actually be cultivated or domesticated. But then it appears from its genetic makeup that einkorn naturally crossed with a wild variety to give us emmer, which then crossed naturally with other wild grasses or wheats to give us spelt. These natural crossings of genetic diversity eventually led to a variety of durum wheat, and then to what is known today as bread wheat. The difference in this ancient natural hybridization and wheat breeding today is that the process today is done deliberately instead of randomly as in nature. Over the past few weeks, I have watched dozens of lectures by wheat breeders. Each took great pride in their work and shared the fascinating heritage of today's wheat, which all comes from taking the genes from ancient wild and domesticated varieties through breeding and bringing them together to produce new, more adaptable varieties. It is important to understand that most wheat breeding today is done through land-grant universities throughout the United States. Their primary goal is to develop wheat varieties that are adaptable to climate, soil, and environmental conditions specific to their geographic location. According to Dr. Brett Carver, an expert in wheat genetics at Oklahoma State University, it takes about 12 years to develop a new variety of wheat, and about one new variety is released every year. According to these experts in their field, it is important to understand some basic facts about the wheat that is grown today. I often hear the statement that our modern wheat today is not like the wheat of our ancestors. It's not our grandfather's wheat. Well, in some ways, this is true. So let's look first today at how our wheat is, in fact, different. First, the varieties today have been specifically bred with traditional breeding methods with other varieties of wheat to create better local adaptation and to improve crop yield. While the head size of the wheat plant today is larger than older varieties, yielding more kernels of grain in each head, the kernel itself is not larger, meaning the basic makeup of the grain is the same. More on that in a moment. We hear much about the dwarf wheat and the wheat of today being shorter, as if that is a bad thing. Again, this is not universally so. It depends on the variety of wheat grown as well as where it is grown. Some varieties will be shorter than others. These shorter plants were considered advantageous characteristics of some existing varieties and were bred to allow more of the energy of the plant to go towards producing more wheat grains instead of a larger plant. This is important as more and more farmland is being scooped up by industry and growth. The farmers now need to produce more food on less available land. And this, in fact, benefits us all in helping to sustain our food supply. Also in these varieties, a shorter plant seemed to be more advantageous as the grain heads were larger. The shorter, more stout stalks prevented the heavier heads from falling over into the ground and rotting. I was so fascinated these past weeks as I watched videos of breeding programs at major universities such as Nebraska, Colorado, and Kansas to see fields of differing varieties of wheat from all over the world. Some varieties had stalks that were at least waist high, while others looked like, honestly, a common patch of grass with stalks no more than a foot tall, if that much. All being grown on university land to look for character traits that would be advantageous to that specific geographic area. It is indeed important to point out these differences in ancient varieties and modern ones, but it is equally important to point out how today's wheat is not different from our grandfather's wheat, how it is the same. Number one, and perhaps the most important myth to be busted, is that today's wheat has the same genetic expression as in ancient varieties. No new variety of wheat contains any genes that were not present in its parents or its ancestors. This is simply genetically impossible with the wheat breeding methods being used. The wheat today also has the same genetic sequence as their ancestors. This sequence is still conserved in the selective breeding process that is used. And perhaps the biggest myth to bust is about the protein or gluten content in modern wheat. The truth, despite what you have read or heard or been told is today's wheat has the same protein content and composition as ancient wheat varieties. Lab analysis don't lie, and ancient varieties have been tested and analyzed comparatively to modern varieties and have found to contain very little, if any, increase in protein content and even some decline in certain varieties, depending again on where the wheat is grown. An important fact to understand is that climate and rainfall during the growing season actually play a bigger role than genetics as to how much protein will be in a wheat crop that year. The genes for the types of proteins that can present themselves in the wheat kernel can be in the genome, but excessive rainfall and warmer temperatures before harvest will greatly reduce the protein content in the crop despite the genetics. This is one reason that hard wheat with a desirable protein content of 11% minimum cannot be produced here in the southeastern United States. The rainfall and warm climate here in the southern states yield a low protein wheat qualifying as a soft wheat only. Wheat breeders are quick to confess that as wheat yield goes up in their breeding, the protein content typically goes down. Yet misinformation is being proliferated based on false claims in popular books written by authors who claim to be experts that are blaming the health demise of America on what they call the most toxic poison of our day, wheat. Really? But nothing could be further from the truth. And these claims have slandered one of the most nutritious foods God has given us and has actually instilled fear in the average concerned consumer. For example, a 2012 National Geographic article stated that modern wheat choices likely exacerbate the problem of celiac disease and that today's farmers prefer protein-rich varieties that produce greater yields. False statement. A New York Times article also blamed the rise of celiac disease on the gluten-rich modern wheat and the increased consumption of wheat. Such false statements as these have reached far and wide into the minds of all of us, as such information can spread with ease across the internet and public media. To understand the whole gluten phenomenon, it's important to understand what gluten actually is and where it comes from. The wheat family of grains has a unique composition of proteins. When wheat flour is hydrated, as in the bread making process, specific proteins found uniquely in wheat form a stretchy substance known as gluten. So gluten is technically not even in wheat, but it is something that is formed from the proteins found in wheat. This gluten formation is responsible for the volume and the texture of bread and other baked goods and provides structure that enables yeast-leavened breads to rise. Without gluten, there would be no beautiful risen loaves of bread. There are two specific proteins in wheat that are responsible for the formation of gluten. They are gliadin and glutenin. Glutenin is mostly responsible for the stretch and elasticity of the dough, while gliadin forms the structure. The genes for these unique proteins of wheat have always been there, even in such ancient grains as einkorn, emmer, and spelt, which is why the wheat family of grains has always been the king of leavened bread making, whether with ancient methods such as sourdough or today's commercial yeast. I know I have shared before about the basic anatomy of a kernel of wheat, so you understand that you have the bran, the germ, and the endosperm. The endosperm is made up of protein and starch and is what we know as white flour. The protein components in wheat make up about 70% of the flour, with about 80% of those proteins being the gluten-forming proteins gliadin and glutenin. Interesting, despite all the claims that modern wheat has been modified to have more gluten, the opposite has actually been discovered. Dr. Casarda, PhD, stated his findings in the Journal of Agriculture and Food Chemistry in 2013, and other scientific studies have followed with the same conclusions, that the modern wheat of today has no more protein or gluten-forming protein content than those of 100 years ago. In fact, some studies actually found that ancient varieties such as einkorn have more protein and gliadin than the modern ones. Again, lab analysis don't lie. Dr. Casarda also emphasizes that modern dwarf wheat is a natural wheat variety cultivated through selective breeding, and that the genes for dwarfism and gluten are not at all associated in the modern wheat. It is often claimed that obesity and other health issues in Americans are directly related to our increased consumption of wheat. Yet the real truth, according to the USDA Economic Research Service, is that wheat consumption in America has actually drastically declined in the past 100 years. Interesting, while meat and sugar consumption has drastically increased. According to the USDA, wheat consumption in 1829 averaged about 225 pounds per person per year. It dropped to about 180 pounds per person per year in 1925 and bottomed out in 1972 with an all-time low of 110 pounds per person per year. There was a slight increase in the 1990s, but only up to 147 pounds per person per year. Then a rapid decrease in 1997 with the adoption of the low carbohydrate, high protein diets. The average wheat consumption today is only about 132 pounds per person per year. That is nearly 100 pounds less per person per year than the amount of wheat consumed 100 years ago. So you see, our wheat consumption has not increased, but actually decreased. And in other countries, such as Japan, that consume much more wheat than we do in America, have by far a much lower incidence of obesity and chronic illness. Another fact that is interesting to note is the drastic change in the consumption of wheat flour. Prior to the 1900s, most of the bread consumed in this country was baked at home. Home baking accounted for 90% of the total flour consumption, while commercial bakeries used only 10%. But with the invention and introduction of the steel rolling mills that could now produce massive volumes of shelf-stable white flour, a striking change began to occur. Commercially processed white flour became commonplace by 1910, and by 1945, after the war, with more women entering the workplace, the home consumption of flour dropped to 40%. While the commercial bakery portion rose to 60%. Today, statistics show that less than 10% of the flour produced in this country is used and consumed at home. This shows that without a doubt, the trend is toward a drastic increase in the consumption of commercially processed breads and flour products. I also found it interesting that one thing Dr. Casader showed had also increased in the U.S. was the consumption of pure wheat gluten. The proteins that form gluten can be isolated from wheat by hydrating the flour, then kneading it into a dough in water until all the starch particles are washed away, leaving a sticky, stretchy, insoluble gluten paste. The gluten paste can then be dried and powdered. This byproduct of wheat is known as wheat gluten and is now added as an isolated ingredient in many processed foods such as soy sauce, packaged dry seasoning mixes, cold cuts, and not to mention it's added in abundance even to breads labeled 100% whole grain. This additional volume of gluten added to breads disrupts the natural ratio of proteins to carbohydrates and fiber found in the whole grain. And we mustn't forget that most breads, crackers, cakes, and cookies are made with commercially processed white flour, which is mostly the gluten-forming proteins and starch. Now, there is nothing unhealthy about these gluten-forming proteins and starch that occur naturally in wheat. In fact, they are important nutrients that our bodies need, some of which are actually known to promote gut health and even brain function. But eaten in this abundant isolation, as in commercially processed foods and wheat products, and without all the other contributing nutrients and fiber that God put in a kernel of wheat, can indeed cause digestive and other health issues, including what seems to be an epidemic of gluten and wheat sensitivities. Most of what is being diagnosed as wheat and gluten sensitivity, and even misdiagnosed as celiac disease today, can actually often be attributed to several factors, including overconsumption of these white flour products and these isolated forms of gluten in commercially processed foods, which are high in sugar and low in fiber, coupled with the overuse of antibiotics, anti-inflammatory drugs, and acid-blocking drugs, which can all contribute to poor digestion and severe digestive issues. It is important to point out here that celiac disease is real, and someone with true genetic celiac disease will never be able to consume wheat of any kind, either ancient or modern, whether freshly milled or not. But wheat does not cause true celiac disease. It is genetic and includes the inability to break down the gliadin component in wheat protein. But the good news is true genetic celiac disease is rare. And for most people, wheat, eaten in its whole form or freshly milled, is not only tolerated, but can also bring healing to many digestive issues. I find it disturbing that so many health professionals do not differentiate between the actual whole grain kernel of wheat and the commercially processed harmful flour products lining the grocery store shelves. I hear so many, doctors included, talk about how bad wheat is, but all the while they are actually referring to the processed bread products that fill the American diet and our grocery store shelves, and they make no differentiation. But there is a huge difference. For example, in my research this week, I came across a video by a health-conscious homesteader. He was, however, regurgitating the myths about wheat that he had probably read and heard. All the evils of our modern dwarf wheat and how it is genetically modified, which is not true. Then he began to say things that I could tell was not about wheat itself, but about processed flour. One of the things he said was that potassium bromate has been added to modern wheat. Potassium bromate is added to commercially processed white flour, not wheat. There is a huge distinction between wheat and commercially processed flour. It is important to acknowledge the difference. So much of what we hear, such as wheat will make you fat, wheat is inflammatory, wheat must be avoided if you're a diabetic, wheat has caused gluten issues. These are misguided facts based on commercially processed bread and flour products and not wheat itself. It is important, I will say it again, to know the difference. These proteins in natural proportions found in the whole grain wheat with the vital nutrients and fiber provided by the bran and germ intact can not only be tolerated by most, but bring amazing health benefits. And we have now heard hundreds of testimonies of this fact. If you haven't already listened to episode 66 of Sue's Healthy Minutes, It's the Bread Story with Sarah Valentine, I encourage you to do so. But it is just one of many amazing stories. Find them on Sue's Healthy Minutes, It's the Bread Stories. Now, I am not a doctor, so I want to be clear that I am not making any medical claims or diagnosis or suggesting any medical treatment. I only want to share what I have learned and seen firsthand in others, so it may bring hope to those that are struggling. I will end today with these thoughts. In one lecture by Dr. Brett Carver, he stated that the biggest problem with wheat today, you ready for it? The proliferation of misinformation. He then quoted an English author by the name of Samuel Butler, who said this, "I hate lying, but it's inaccuracies that I cannot tolerate." What a fitting statement for the topic today. The truth is, wheat is one of the most important food crops grown throughout the world. It provides 20% of the protein and 20% of the calories to people worldwide. I encourage you all to be truth seekers. It is especially important these days. You have to dig a little to find it, but it's there. I have included some links in today's podcast description to get you started. Dr. Carver also stated that only by nature's design could 3 wild grassy weeds come together and form one very sophisticated but complex plant we now call wheat. But I know that it was not nature's design, but God's. Wheat and other grains are one of the most nutrient-dense foods that God has given us, and they are perfectly nutritious and perfectly storable. Don't let anyone deceive you with misinformation. Thank you for listening today. It was a heavy topic, I know, but until next time, this is Sue Becker from Bread Beckers with Sue's Healthy Minutes.
Sue's Healthy Minutes podcast has been a presentation by the Bread Beckers Incorporated located in Woodstock, Georgia. For more information, store hours, and learning opportunities, visit breadbeckers.com and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Make sure to subscribe to this podcast and never miss an episode. Share this with 2 friends who would benefit from this information, and be sure to join us again next week for more of Sue's Healthy Minutes.